we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, moral authority remains compromised.
The moral authority of the president compromised. That was Republican Senator Tim Scott, who's been very critical in recent days of President Trump. Right now, the president is in Bedminster, New Jersey, where he is spending the final hours of his working vacation. CNN's Boris Sanchez is nearby in Bridgewater, New Jersey. Boris, the president returning to the White House, but he's not going to be there for long.
That's right, Jim. This 17-day working vacation for President Trump in Bedminster, New Jersey is almost over. He's just a few hours away from heading back to Washington, D.C. before then going on to Arizona later this week. But the White House is still reeling from the criticism the president has received after his divisive remarks about the violence in Charlottesville last week. And we've seen the fallout not just in criticism from members of the president's own party, but the implosion of the specialized councils that the president had put together on manufacturing and strategy and policy, and the infrastructure council. We've also seen several charities fleeing events that were scheduled to be held at the president's estate in Mar-a-Lago. All of that, though, still the main focus here in Bedminster, as several people are now coming forward to defend the president. One of them, Jerry Falwell Jr., the evangelist, was actually on ABC earlier today saying that the president's response to the violence in Charlottesville was appropriate. Listen to some of what he said.
The bold and truthful statements I was referring to were his willingness to call evil and terrorism by its name, to identify the groups, the Nazis, the KKK, the white supremacists. That's something a leader should do, and I admire him for that. He's substance over form. So many of our politicians, recent leaders, national leaders, have been form over substance. They tell people what they want to hear. They sugarcoat everything, or they have sugarcoated everything. And I think the American people have gotten sort of thin-skinned, and I think they need to listen to the substance of what he said. One of the reasons I supported him, because he doesn't say what's politically correct. He says what's in his heart, what he believes. And sometimes that gets him in trouble. But he does not have a racist bone in his body. I know him well. He is working so hard to help minorities and people in the inner cities up through. He says that school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. Betsy DeVos has been traveling around the country trying to promote school choice to help inner city youth get to choose which schools they attend and not be stuck in a public school that's failing in a big city. And he's doing so many other things to bring jobs back to the inner city.
Now, Falwell went on to give a very interesting answer to a question trying to clarify what the president meant when he said that there were good people on both sides, referring to counter-protesters and Nazis. And Falwell said that it's very possible that the president might have specific inside information that the rest of us don't. Still unclear exactly what he meant by that. Getting back to the president's schedule this week as he heads to Arizona on Tuesday, he's scheduled to take part of some tours in Yuma before then heading on to Phoenix later on Tuesday night to take part of a rally. Several Republicans, including Ohio Governor John Kasich, pleaded with the president on the Sunday morning shows earlier today to be more inclusive in his language. Others, including the mayor of Phoenix, Greg Stanton, said the president should perhaps delay this event in light of the divisive comments that he made again last week on Tuesday, Jim.
Boris Sanchez there with the president in New Jersey. Be sure to watch Paul Ryan's town hall tomorrow right here on CNN, 9 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll be right back. Is getting in line for special eyeglasses. My wife and I were doing that earlier today, or getting in line on the highways to get the best viewing cities and towns. Americans are gearing up for Monday's once-in-a-century total eclipse of the sun. According to a CNN poll, 60% of Americans living in states in the direct path of the eclipse plan to watch the historic event. Nearly half of Americans nationwide plan to take a careful peek. CNN has crews spread far and wide along the path of this eclipse, including CNN's Miguel Marquez, who joins us now live from Portland, Oregon. Miguel, first of all, I'm very jealous of you. I saw one before overseas years ago, so no fair. I'll say that right away. What's the buzz like there? I mean, is there a huge influx of people coming from all over to catch this?
It is going to be jam-packed. The buzz is totality. This is like the World Cup and the World Series and the Olympics all jammed into one. The difference here is the main event only lasts about 2.5 minutes. Countdown to total eclipse, coast to coast.
This is the sun, and then this is the eclipse, and then this is the moon, and it goes directly at it, and then makes it totally dark.
Its path.
I leave for work.
An astronomical celebration from Oregon to South Carolina. The place to be, the 70-mile swath of full eclipse, or totality. Moon shadow racing across the country, right through 12 states, turning day to night. What do you think's going to happen?
Like, I don't think you really should look at the sun. It might, like,
No, you shouldn't.
burn your eyes.
Good advice. Heated everywhere. In Chicago, long lines despite the rain for eclipse viewing glasses. Eclipse traffic already heavy.
We're hearing a lot of information about that traffic's going to be real heavy that day. We're going to be staying home.
Cities and small towns along the path of totality preparing for massive crowds.
You think you could literally double, triple, quadruple the size of this place overnight? Oh, yeah, very much so. And the people will be spread out through town.
In Idaho, all hands on deck for massive crowds across the country. Friends staying with friends, families coming together, millions on the move, even camping out for this once-in-a-lifetime happening. You've been planning this trip for how long?
At least 7 years.
7 years?
Yes. We got 2 vehicles with truck campers, and we left at 4:30 in the morning. We got here about 3:30 in the afternoon.
In the path of totality, total eclipse of the theme for everything from dark of day wine in Nebraska to martinis in Oregon.
We take the martini glass and we rim it with a little bit of Oreo crusted.
And of course, eclipsical donuts.
It's a chocolate top. It's got the sun ring around it. But then when you break it open, it's full of sunshine and orange creamsicle flavoring.
This eclipse unique for the U.S. Last time one went coast to coast here, 1918. Woodrow Wilson was president, and the First World War was nearing its end. All right, we are absolutely nerding out here. We have the binoculars with the solar filters on. You can actually see sunspots right now. The glasses is what most people will have on. They look kind of like normal glasses, like they're just mirrored, but when you kind of look through them, you literally can't see a thing unless staring at the sun. This is where you'll find me. Jim?
And to be clear, you got to wear those to look at this, right? I mean, folks should not be attempting to do this with just naked eye.
When it hits totality, you can take them off for those couple of minutes in totality, but then they have to go back on. Like any day of the year, if you stare at the sun, that's a really dumb thing to do.
And you got to be totality. That you got to have it totally covered, right? So there's going to be some minutes when it's partially covered before and after. Again, you should be using those glasses, right?
Yeah, there will be seconds just before the Bailey's beads, as they call them, and diamonds as they come off that sun. That you still have to have them on then, Jim.
Okay. Dr. Marquez, thank you very much. Enjoy the show. We have much more just ahead in the newsroom right after this short break.
Last week, Google fired a male employee over his 3,300-word memo that claimed women are underrepresented in tech, partly because of biological differences such as higher neuroticism and interest in people. Today, only 31% of Google's employees are women. The company's tech sector, that number falls to 20%. It brings me to my question of the week. What percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs are women? 32%, 27%, 19%, or 6%? Stay tuned and we'll tell you the correct answer. This week's book of the week is Mark Liller's new book, The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics, which you heard about earlier in the show. It's a terrific short book about the decline of American liberalism, explaining how the Democrats went from the successes of FDR's coalition to the pitfalls of today's identity politics. It's an accessible book that's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand how we arrived in the Trump era, where the Democrats go from here. Now for the last look. This week, residents of Guam breathed a sigh of relief after North Korea announced that Kim Jong-un would watch a little more the foolish and stupid conduct of the Yankees before deciding to launch missiles near the island. But there is another problem pestering this paradise. Although there are only 163,000 people on the island, there are as many as 2 million brown tree snakes. That's right. For every one human, there are 12 of this invasive species slithering through the trees. These serpents have reportedly cost millions by regularly shorting the island's electrical systems. They have killed most of Guam's native bird species. And did I mention 12 snakes for every human? The solution seems to be drugged mice. You see, it turns out brown tree snakes love to eat mice and are easily killed by acetaminophen. In other words, Tylenol. Put that in dead mice and parachute them around the island. Delivered last meals for many snakes. The USDA has done this multiple times before, going back at least 7 years. They are now set for another round in October, giving the beleaguered Guamanians a slightly less terrifying reason to look toward the sky. The answer to my GPS challenge question this week is D. Only 6%, or a total of 32 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, are female. While this might seem startlingly small, there are more female CEOs in the Fortune 500 list than ever before, meaning this tiny figure still does signify progress. Women fare slightly better in the tech world at large. Of all computing employees, and that includes jobs like programmers, developers, and IT support, only 26% were female, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But even with things looking up, there is a long way to go. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.
Hello, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jim for Frederica Whitfield. President Trump hoping to turn the page after a turbulent week of backlash over his response to the Charlottesville violence. Much of that criticism coming this morning from inside his own party.
As we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, moral authority remains compromised.
You know, blaming one side or another when we're talking about the KKK or white supremacists, there is no comparison between hate groups and everybody else.
Those were just two Republicans you were hearing from. And now, as the president returns from his working vacation and prepares for a campaign-style rally on Tuesday in Phoenix, Arizona, a brand new poll shows that his approval numbers in 3 states that he won have now fallen below 40%. This as North Korea issues a new nuclear threat to the U.S. The rogue nation says that it is now ready to, quote, mercilessly strike as it accuses the, quote, reckless U.S. of driving the two countries to the brink of nuclear war. We'll have more on that in just a minute, but first, we begin in Bedminster, New Jersey, where the president is spending the final hours of that working vacation. CNN's Boris Sanchez nearby in Bridgewater. Boris, the president returning to the White House. He will not be there for long, though.
That's right, Jim. The president's 17-day working vacation to Bedminster, New Jersey wraps up today. He's heading back to Washington, D.C. tonight, but as you said, he is heading to Arizona this week. On Tuesday, he is going to take part in some kind of tour in Yuma. We don't have clarity on specifically what he will be touring, but we know that later that night, he is going to head to Phoenix for a rally. And the White House has been reeling, as you said, Jim, from the president's press conference last Tuesday that received harsh criticism from both sides of the aisle. Many in his own party are now urging the president to be more inclusive in his language, and specifically at this rally on Phoenix, some want to see him take a much more conciliatory tone. One of the president's critics, John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, was on State of the Union this morning with Jake Tapper. Listen to what he said.
The president is our president. We want him to be successful. People around him have to get to him, including his own family, to say, okay, you need to show leadership. You need to bring the country together. You're going to go to Phoenix and make a speech, fine. That's your right. You can go there. He's got free speech just like the rest of us have it. But when you go, try to use that as an opportunity to say something that's going to bring people together.
Now, some have actually gone further than that, Jim, including the mayor of Phoenix. You know, over the past several days, there's been speculation that the president might use this rally as an occasion to pardon Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who's been heavily criticized across the country for racial profiling in the state of Arizona. The president himself said that it was something he was considering. Here's a statement from the mayor of Phoenix, Greg Stanton, who writes, quote, "If President Trump is coming to Phoenix to announce a pardon for former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, then it will be clear that his true intent is to inflame emotions and further divide our nation. It is my hope that more sound judgment prevails and that he delays his visit." Jim, we've received no indication so far from the White House that the president has any intention of delaying this visit. No indication yet as to whether or not he may end up pardoning Sheriff Arpaio. Jim?
Boris Chan says they're traveling with the president. President Trump faced his fair share of heat, as we've said this week, over his response to the Charlottesville violence. And as we said, it wasn't just Democrats, Republicans adding their voices to the chorus of criticism, too. This morning, several lawmakers said their word on the Sunday shows.
Where I want to look now is what are we going to do to deal with the fundamental issues that we have in the country, the issue of race, the issue of police and community coming together and developing policing methods that can unify.
You know, anyone that's committing violence ought to be condemned. Anyone. There's no justification for it whatsoever. And we can't allow the commander-in-chief to somehow equate the handful of people that would make those protests violent with any kind of sentiment that condones white supremacy or neo-Nazism.
Well, I think what he said on Monday was fantastic. It would have been even better had he said it on Saturday. What he said on Tuesday was just really challenging. What the president should do before he says something is to sit down and become better acquainted, have a personal connection to the painful history of racism and bigotry of this country.
It is not just fellow politicians who are disappointed in how the president is handling his job today. A new poll of Rust Belt states that helped push President Trump into the White House show that his approval numbers are dropping to new lows, and this is key, below the 40% mark. The new NBC News Marist poll surveyed voters in 3 states that Trump won in 2016, key states. In Michigan, 36% of adults approve of his job performance. In Pennsylvania, just 33%. Same in Wisconsin. Of course, you remember what a key role those states played in his election win. All of them surprises, really, taking them away from Hillary Clinton, the Democrat. Let's discuss this now with our panel. Julian Zelizer is a CNN political analyst. He's also a historian at Princeton University. Tanzina Vega is CNN's race and inequality reporter. And Andre Brower is the former lieutenant governor of South Carolina, Trump supporter as well. Julian, I want to start with you as we look at these numbers. This poll, we should mention, was conducted after the violence, the unrest in Charlottesville. We're just 7 months into the president's term, and yet we're 3.5 years nearly from the next presidential election. How key are these approval numbers right now, today?
Well, they're important because Republicans are not looking at 2020. Politically, they're looking at 2018. And they're trying to figure out what impact might this have on the midterms. And some Republicans are also trying to figure out what impact do the statements from that press conference and other statements that he has made have on the reputation and image of the GOP more broadly. So I think the poll numbers are significant, even if they come very early in the presidency.
Andre Brower, do you sense nervousness within Trump's team? Do you look at these numbers and see concern about 2018 as well as 2020?
Well, I don't know that you immediately see concern. You'd always rather have your poll numbers better than going in the opposite direction. But more than anything, what's important to me is when I supported Donald Trump, I wanted to see somebody come in and make substantial change. What he's got to do more than anything right now is he's got to make sure that he works with members of Congress. And so if they get down on him and he can't get his agenda passed, that's where the real problem lies. If he can get people back to work, if he can continue to make people's lives better, a lot of this other stuff will go away. But one of the strong suits in my 14 years in the General Assembly and Lieutenant Governor was I made big friends with certain groups. The Black Caucus was one of my best groups to work with when I needed things passed, and I would come off the podium and talk to them. He's got to have core groups of supporters, not just Republicans, that will work with him to get his agenda passed, and that's going to be key. more than right now battleground states, but people like Kid Rock who are ultimately thinking about making a Senate run, when they see these numbers go down, that may discourage him from running. So those are important in secondary aspects of what the president wants to try to get done.
Do you see the president doing the opposite of the advice that you just gave him there, Andre? You talk about reaching out. I mean, for one, he's attacking his own Republican colleagues, as you know, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, but also certainly not building bridges with, for instance, minority voters in terms of his handling of Charlottesville. Does that concern you in particular, or most immediately for his agenda?
Donald Trump is a brilliant guy, and he does a lot of things that are not what we would all expect. He's had a good week and a bad week. But I would say this, in 2000, Donald Trump didn't do real well in the real estate market, but he learned substantially from that and the licks he took, and he talked about it. In 2008, when a lot of people are suffering, he was able to turn his business, what he had learned from failing times, and really capitalize on a bad market. And so I hope the bad times he had this past week, he'll learn from those and capitalize on an opportunity to unite this country, unite the two parties to try to work together on common things like a dialogue. I thought John Kasich was so good this morning, talking about making sure that the people that felt like they were downtrodden had a piece of the pie, that we work together for goodwill. And John Kasich did an excellent job this morning on conveying what I thought was a conservative message, but a message that all of us feel the hurt. All of us want to see people do better, and all of us want to make sure that nobody feels like that the Republican Party supports the KKK or these hate groups, because we don't.
Tanzina, I want to ask you, because Senator Tim Scott, in addition to Governor John Kasich, added his voice to the chorus of GOP criticism of President Trump's handling of Charlottesville. I want to play his sound again on State of the Union this morning. He had some very strong words, and get your reaction.
As we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, that moral authority remains compromised.
That's a Republican senator there, Tanzina, saying that the president's moral authority is compromised. How damaging is that for, I mean, particularly in the African-American community, but beyond that as well?
I think that you're seeing some really significant comments coming out of this past week, particularly from people in the GOP. You know, after the last election, not this past election, but the last election of President Obama, the GOP had to really do an analysis and came out actually with a report saying how much they needed to get better at connecting with and communicating with communities of color, women voters, et cetera, and marginalized communities. And I think what we've seen is they've gone the opposite way. They zigged instead of zagging. And so, and in addition to that, you're also seeing that the president himself is inconsistent on his messaging when it comes to this. You know, we get a late response, then we get what some people are saying is a decent response, and then we get, you know, the press conference on Tuesday. And so I think we have to take Americans' intelligence pretty seriously and understand that it's a little bit insulting to assume that, you know, we can just sort of pivot back and forth on issues that are so fundamental to American democracy and society, and racism is one of those issues.
People have memories, right? And emotional issues are the ones that tend to stick. Julian, I want to ask you this, though, because after the 2016 election, there was criticism of the Democratic Party, of the standard bearer Hillary Clinton, but also other candidates, the strategy, and criticism from within the party for going too far, leaning too heavily on identity politics. Do you see a danger here of overemphasizing, if that's the right word, just purely from a politically strategic perspective? And you even heard Steve Bannon in one of his quote-unquote exit interviews this week saying that the Republicans would benefit, in his view, if the Democrats went entirely down that path. Do you see dangers there?
Maybe, but I don't think the Democrats want to listen to Stephen Bannon for advice. I think...
But it's not just, to be clear, it's not just Stephen Bannon who gave that criticism. After 2016, you heard that from Democrats as well.
Yeah, but I think what this week revealed is some of those issues that are often characterized or even dismissed as identity politics are often social rights politics. It's about racial equality, about gender equality. It's about the rights of immigrants, ideas that have been really at the core of democratic politics since the 1960s. And I'm not sure the right kind of move is for Democrats to abandon those or even to dismiss those. It's true they have to pay more attention to the economy. It's true they have to look at how many middle-class Americans feel insecure. But I think they are onto some values that have been pretty important. And this week revealed why, when the president moved in the wrong direction, addressing what happened in.
Also, if I could jump in there for one second.
Please jump in. It'll be the final word because we're running short of time.
The phrase identity politics is often used to describe only when we're talking about communities of color and marginalized communities. This election cycle, this administration, and Stephen Bannon in particular have relied very heavily on white identity politics. And so we need to sort of examine what we're saying when we're talking about whose country we're taking back, and all of these other sort of euphemisms that were used throughout the campaign and beyond.
How about American identity politics?
Correct.
Maybe we could agree on that. Julian, Andre, Tanzina, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, a sharp new warning from North Korea, right as the U.S. prepares for military exercises in South Korea, just across the border. This comes as one former presidential candidate says it is time to take out the rogue nation's missile systems. Details right after this.
CNN Newsroom, brought to you by Kind Snacks. Ingredients you can see and pronounce. CNN.
I think everything changed last weekend. I think that was one of those moments in a nation's history where everything turns.
That's the mayor of Charlottesville, Michael Signer, speaking just 1 week after that white supremacist rally and the Tiki Torch March through his town. Let's talk about it all with the panel. Bakari Sellers, let me ask you, do you think that it's true that everything changed for the country last weekend?
Well, I think it was a tragic day for the country, but white supremacy is not new. It didn't start with Donald Trump. It has been magnified and lifted up and put on another playing field, but I don't think that anything has necessarily changed. It won't change until individuals who don't look like Nina and I decide that enough is enough. This isn't a partisan issue. And so many people confuse patriotism and prejudice. And what we saw on display was so much prejudice. And I hope that individuals, especially white evangelicals in the United States of America, decide to stand up and say enough is enough. And Donald Trump is perverting and giving these individuals a platform, and he should not. That's all we're asking for.
Congressman, you've seen a lot of the tensions up close this week in your home state. I'm sorry, your home Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yeah.
What was your reaction? What do you think?
Well, actually, ironically, I was in Israel when all that stuff was going on and seeing that. So, I agree with some of the things that Bakari said in terms of folks need to rise up. And largely you have seen that, of course. I think there's no place for hate in Virginia or America. And I think that you did see that on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican people coming out and condemning what was going on. It was a tragic day for Virginia and for the nation, of course, too. I was critical of the president of how the second press conference was strong and they hit the right note, but the third was not. But at the same time, I think it's important that politics of identity, racial politics, tribal politics, quite frankly, are not what this nation needs. And anyone who's espousing them, I think, are wrong. I think we should be focused on building this country as opposed to tearing it down.
Nina, what was it like for you this last week?
Heavy. I want to read a brief quote from Dr. Crystal Fleming. She wrote an article in The Root that I think informs exactly what Bakari just said. She said, it is clear that our nation is in the midst of a very public and painful reckoning with the memory and, among other things, ongoing white supremacy. And that's it. That, in other words, what transpired in Virginia was just a tipping point, but this has been happening in the country all along. And until we go deeper, showing disgust for and standing up very clearly and unified against racism and bigotry like the neo-Nazis and KKK inspired, but we got to go deeper to deal with mass incarceration in this country that locks up more black and brown folks and poor folks. We got to deal with income and wealth inequality, the inequality in our school system. So dealing with neo-Nazis is one thing, but dealing with systemic racism is another. And this is a day of reckoning for our country.
Senator?
Yeah, see, that's that kind of talk that really, I think, it causes problems for a lot of America, that says somehow or another that if you're white, you're somehow racist. And I mean, that's what it said. You talked about systemic racism, and as opposed to neo-Nazis. I agree. I mean, I think everybody has stood up and said, that we're obviously against white supremacy. I don't know of anybody who has spoken in favor of
certainly
this
on the platform.
Yes, certainly nobody that I'm aware of. But the idea of then saying, well, this is a larger problem I just would say that we have problems of racism in this country, but that's not, tying that to white supremacists, I think is a whole
250 years worth of slavery.
250
250 years worth of slavery, almost 100 years worth of Jim Crow in this country. The fact that the systems in this country still treat Black folks, in particular, African-American folks, as second-class citizens. And part of what the senator doesn't want to face is also part of the problem. No one has said, Bakari or nobody has said that all white people are racist. But we do in this country have racist institutions. Look, there were white folks out there marching against the neo-Nazis and the KKK. But the fact that we can't deal with systemic racism in this country, something is wrong with that.
And I hope that you're uncomfortable with the conversation, because this conversation is uncomfortable. It's something that we have to deal with. But the fact is, we can go to East Chicago and we can go to Flint, Michigan. Yes. And let me tell you that they have environmental injustices that do not happen in Orange County. There are places that do not happen in affluent areas of this country, affluent white areas of this country. In South Carolina,
you have poor white areas.
There's no doubt about it. They're suffering. But let's have a conversation about the systemic injustices that we have. And there's a direct.
But the systemic injustices are not necessarily race injustices.
They're also. You're saying that they're more. You're saying
there are some, but
class is what you're saying.
Yeah, this look.
And then we'll come to you.
This is an issue about, and I think we can agree on that. There are problems in this country where there are millions of people who do not have opportunities and to be able to rise. But you can find that in rural areas of this country, throughout Appalachia and areas of my state and West Virginia, Kentucky, just so you can find them in Detroit and Philadelphia and other places. And to suggest that is racist I just think clouds the issue that we have serious problems to confront here, and covering it with race is, I just think, not.
One second, let me touch on a couple of things, because I think there's some good points on both sides here. Both Nina and the senator have brought up good points. And when you look at, I think you have to separate some things. So when you look at Virginia, you can't drive 5-10 miles without seeing something that is a monument to the war dead in the Civil War, or a Civil War battlefield, or a monument itself. That is a separate issue for one of the things that Nina brought up, which I agree with. We do have a big problem with criminal justice reform here, and we need improvement. There's no question about that. Economic opportunity for folks, both in white Appalachia as well as in Black communities as well, too. There's no question about that, but you have to separate the two. They are not the same thing.
But they are.
Hold on. They're not the same thing when you're talking about white supremacists and marching and taking monuments, saying that symbol, like a monument to the war dead or something like that, or even Jefferson, for example, some of his, and you have seen the conversation move to that direction. That there are very real problems that we need to address in criminal justice improvement and other substantive problems. That's not the same thing as marching and taking down a statue that someone has driven by 1,000 times and never even had any problem with.
Income and wealth inequality. My only point is this.
I agree with that.
Is that in our face, overt racism and bigotry that was on display in Virginia is one thing.
Small, tiny little.
But we deal with that. But I'm saying beyond that, and that's what Professor Fleming was saying too. How do we deal with, in this country, systemic racism? I get Appalachia. I visit Appalachia. I travel Appalachia. I understand. I talked to a woman yesterday by the name of Portia, who lives in Ohio, who was crying her eyes out. She is on the front lines for racial equality, but she also talks about the fact that in her county, in Ohio, that there are poor white folks, and I get that. And so the fact that we're willing to talk about class, but sometimes you guys don't want to talk about both. Race.
Let's do Bakari and then the senator.
But I can't let you separate that, because that's an easy way out. That's a cop-out. And the reason that it's a cop-out is because you have this conversation about race. And these statues, these monuments, many of them were erected during the Jim Crow era when we were making progress in civil rights. It was a big thumb in your eye. That's why the Confederate flag went up in South Carolina. That's why these monuments went up throughout the country. And to have a statue of someone,
not all of them.
But that's a lot of them. And to have a statue of someone like a Robert E. Lee, to have a statue of someone like a Pitchfork Ben Tillman or John C. Calhoun, whose name, by the way, was John C. Killicoon, to have these individuals just revered. Do you understand how you may not, but as a black man, let me tell you, That is very, very painful.
Don't talk condescendingly.
No, I'm not. But I'm just saying that is very painful. And the reason that it's painful, and this conversation has to be uncomfortable, the reason that it's painful is because
I'm comfortable having these conversations. Let me say, listen, you have to be able to separate some things. There's no question about it. Look, I understand you can be empathetic to understand how you're coming from and where we're coming from. Some of these monuments in Virginia, for example, and there are millions of Virginians who don't support this because some of these are their families. Some of those are sacred monuments to war dead. Those are big issues, and their history is very layered. Let me paraphrase the black mayor of Richmond, LeVar Stoney, who's a great man, who said a couple of months ago, this has since changed, but a couple of months ago he said, because of politics, but he said, keep the statues, but teach the context. Create more statues to teach history and the context. That is extremely important. Our history is not perfect, it's imperfect, but we have the ability to move towards a more perfect union, and most countries don't have that.
We're just going to take a very quick break and continue this conversation. We just have to pay some bills. Stick around.
And we are back with Robin Wright, Angela Rye, Mark Lilla, and Roy Blunt Jr. Mark, I want to come back to you to ask about, again, going forward. It does seem as though the Trump strategy right now is go to your base and play this game of white identity politics. Will it reinforce a kind of diehard opposition? What should the left do? Your book is written as you put it, as a once and future liberal. You don't want them to play identity politics, but what do you do if the other side is playing identity politics?
Well, the first thing you have to recognize is that it works for them and it doesn't work for us. But beyond that, I think what's important here, and it showed up in Robin Wright's article, is that there's some glue that's missing in this country, something that keeps us together. It's not so much that we're loggerheads, but we're drifting apart. There once used to be a Democratic vision, a Democratic Party vision, a liberal vision of what we stood for as a nation, what made us citizens, how we could work together in a political way on the basis of solidarity and equal protection. Then there was a Reagan view, which was that the less government, the better. We're all by ourselves in our families and churches, and good luck to you. That vision was destroyed by Donald Trump. He destroyed Reagan's party. And now neither party and neither ideology.
And in a sense, you're saying liberals never had a response to Reagan's vision. They just kind of retreated into identity politics.
Exactly. That was a time, you see, Reagan's vision was anti-political. And it was a time for liberals to make the case for democratic political life and the legitimacy of government and the legitimacy of helping each other out. And by retreating, they made a tactical mistake, I think. And I don't think many people have a sense, and I don't think Democrats have a sense of what their vision of the future is. I mean, if you listen to the rhetoric of JFK or FDR or Reagan, you very quickly get a sense of what kind of world they want to create. We don't have that. Without a national narrative, without ideologies that even bring parties together, we become like elementary particles flying apart, and that's when trouble starts.
Angela Rye, how do you bring the Democrats or the country together?
Well, I think first on the Democratic part, obviously, as a Democrat, at least someone who votes Democrat, I disagree a little bit. I think recently they've introduced a plan that leans more into economics, which of course is a more unifying principle. And I think that there's a struggle when you are known to be a big tent, right? There are a lot of different interests that you have to cater to. And I think that historically Democrats have struggled to figure out what is that sweet spot, as well as this country that some folks call melting pot. I prefer jambalaya. Because we're all different, and I like that we can appreciate differences. The only path forward, I think, is to begin to tell the truth about our history. It's one that is troubled, it's one that is challenging, full of conflicts, and full of hypocrisy. And until we can embrace what that narrative is, as uncomfortable as it might be for some, we're not going to get further ahead.
Robin Wright, that seems to me to be a recipe for more conflict, because as we tell that history, there are a lot of people who will say that's not my history, and as Roy Blunt was saying, that's that you're politicizing it, or I just feel like you're going to get a backlash.
Well, we haven't resolved many of the issues that surfaced during the Civil War, including how do you ensure people of color not only voting rights but equal rights. And so there are a number of haunting questions that still have to be addressed. The 14th Amendment is still deeply divisive in this country. One of the things that's striking about parties is if you look at the period that in the run-up to the Civil War, you saw the disintegration of the two parties, the disintegration of the Whig Party that opened the way for the Republicans and the emergence of Abraham Lincoln, and the Democrats dividing into Northern and Southern Democrats. That there are some kind of uncanny parallels and some haunting questions that this nation has not moved together to try to resolve, and it plays out in this issue of statues. How ironic, pieces of steel.
Roy Blunt, you covered the civil rights movement in the early 60s. You interviewed Martin Luther King. It seems to me Robin Wright's article really suggests that what we might end up with is not another civil war, but another period like the late 50s and 60s, where you had, deep political divisions, some violence, a kind of conflict that didn't seem like it could be mediated. What seems similar and what seems different?
Well, I was living in the South then. You had the majority of white people were on the wrong side, and so were the majority of the governors and police. But at the national level, in the White House, we had Kennedy and Johnson, and they were pretty good. But now we have all the way to the top. We've got a president who can't tell the difference between Nazis and anti-Nazis. And that's very unsettling, very confusing, and very encouraging to the Nazis. And so in some ways, it's more indefinite and scarier now, I think. People haven't, I don't even want to get into shooting. There was lots of that in the civil rights movement, and there are lots of guns out there now.
On that sobering note, we have to leave it. Thank you all. Next on GPS, from Charlottesville to Spain, cars and trucks used as weapons. Peter Bergen will tell us how we should think of this new favorite tactic, terror.